The silk was supposed to protect her. That's what Rosalind Greymont had been told when they dressed her that morning, layer upon layer of ivory fabric, delicate as moth wings, expensive enough to feed a village for a month. The kind of gown that whispered promises of a future gilded in gold and security. A future where she would stand beside Caspian Haltworth as his bride, his equal, his partner in building something better for their people. But silk doesn't stop a man's hands when he decides you're disposable. And it certainly doesn't keep you warm when you're bleeding out in the snow. Rosalind's body lay twisted at an angle that didn't feel like her own anymore, half buried in a drift of white that had turned crimson beneath her. The cold had stopped biting 10 minutes ago, or maybe it was an hour, she couldn't tell anymore. Time had become something slippery, something that moved in strange rhythms against the pounding of her fading heartbeat. Above her, the moon hung fat and indifferent in a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Stars scattered like thrown diamonds. Beautiful. Cruel. Witnesses to her execution. Her ribs screamed with every shallow breath. Something inside her chest had cracked when she hit the ground. She'd heard it snap, a sound like greenwood breaking, and then the pain had come in waves so vicious she'd vomited into the snow. The taste of copper still coated her tongue. Her left arm lay at an impossible angle, useless, the bone beneath her skin pressing against fabric that was never meant to touch violence. And her legs, God, her legs, she couldn't feel them anymore. Couldn't tell if they were broken or just frozen, or if her body had simply decided to stop trying. She'd stopped screaming for help after the first few minutes. No one was coming. The forest roads stretched empty in both directions, nothing but skeletal trees and endless white, and the kind of silence that made you understand how alone you really were. The carriage that had carried her from her father's estate to what was supposed to be her wedding was long gone. She could still hear the wheels crunching over ice, the horse's breath clouding the air, Caspian's voice floating through the window with that same easy charm he'd used to court her for 6 months. "You know too much, Rosalind." He'd said it the way someone might comment on the weather. Casual. Matter of fact. And then his hands had been on her shoulders, and the door had swung open, and the world had tilted sideways as he shoved her from the moving carriage with the same care you'd use to discard trash. No rage in his eyes. No remorse. Just cold calculation, the kind that came from a man who'd learned early that power mattered more than conscience. She'd discovered the ledgers 3 days ago. Hidden in his study, tucked behind a false panel in the bookshelf, pages and pages of careful records showing exactly where the Haltworth pack's money had really been going. Funds meant for widows who'd lost their mates in territorial disputes. Funds meant for orphaned pups who needed food and shelter. Funds meant for injured Omegas who couldn't work anymore, who relied on pack support to survive. All of it redirected, siphoned off into private accounts, used to buy political influence and expand Haltworth territory while the vulnerable starved. Rosalind had stood in that study with her hands shaking, staring at numbers that represented real suffering, real hunger, real abandonment. And she'd believed, God, she'd been naive enough to believe, that if she showed Caspian, if she explained what she'd found, if she appealed to whatever shred of decency he might have buried beneath that polished exterior, he would fix it. Make it right. Choose mercy over power. Instead, he'd smiled at her. That same charming smile that had first caught her attention at the spring gathering, the one that made him look boyish and trustworthy and safe. He'd poured her tea with steady hands and told her she was right to bring this to his attention. He'd called for the carriage to take her to meet with the pack elders so they could discuss the matter properly. He'd kissed her forehead and promised everything would be handled with discretion. And then he'd thrown her into the snow to die. Because dead women don't testify. Dead women don't expose corruption. Dead women certainly don't stand in the way of a man's ambition. Rosalind's vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in like smoke. Her breath came in thin, rattling gasps that barely moved her chest. The cold had burrowed so deep into her bones that her body felt like it belonged to someone else, something distant and fading and no longer entirely hers. She could feel herself slipping away, piece by piece, consciousness unraveling like thread pulled from cloth. This was how it ended then. Not in glory. Not in purpose. Just another woman who'd trusted the wrong man, another body the snow would bury by morning, another story that would be twisted into something convenient. They'd say she'd gotten cold feet about the wedding. Run away. Had an accident. No one would question it too hard. The Haltworths were too powerful, too connected, too important to the political balance of the North. And Rosalind was just a minor pack daughter with no real leverage and a bleeding heart that had gotten her killed. She closed her eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled long and mournful, the sound carrying across miles of frozen wilderness. Another answered it, and then another, a chorus of wild voices that made something deep in Rosalind's chest ache with a longing she couldn't name. She'd never shifted. Never felt the call of the wolf the way other pack members described it, that primal knowing that lived beneath your skin and pulled you toward your true form. Her father had called it a blessing, one less thing for enemies to exploit. Her mother had called it a curse, a daughter who couldn't fully belong to the world she'd been born into. Right now, dying in the snow with her bones shattered and her blood painting the ground red, Rosalind thought maybe it didn't matter either way. The howling grew closer. No, not howling. Something else. Something that made the air itself seem to vibrate with warning, a sound like thunder rolling through the earth, except there were no clouds and the sky remained crystalline and clear. Rosalind's eyes snapped open, instinct flaring through the fog of approaching death. She knew that sound. Every wolf knew that sound, even ones who'd never shifted. Hooves. Moving fast. Moving with purpose. Her heart lurched against her broken ribs, hope and terror tangling together until she couldn't tell which one was stronger. Someone was coming. But was it rescue or just a different kind of ending? The forest road wasn't traveled much this time of year. Too dangerous, too isolated, too easy to get caught in a storm and never make it to the next settlement. Anyone riding out here in the deep cold was either desperate or dangerous, and Rosalind wasn't sure which option scared her more. The hoofbeats grew thunderous, impossibly close, and then a massive shape burst from the tree line like something out of legend. A black wolf. Bigger than any she'd ever seen, bigger than should have been possible, easily the size of a draft horse, muscle and midnight fur, and eyes that glowed silver in the moonlight like coins pulled from a frozen lake. The creature moved with a predator's grace, powerful and fluid and absolutely certain of its dominance in this space. Snow exploded beneath its paws. Breath clouded the air in great plumes. And those eyes, God, those eyes fixed on Rosalind with an intensity that made her feel pinned, seen, stripped of every defense she might have once possessed. The wolf stopped 10 feet away. For a moment, nothing moved. The world held its breath. Rosalind stared up at the creature through her tears and her fading vision and tried to understand what she was seeing. Tried to understand why a wolf this powerful, this clearly alpha, would be out here alone. Tried to understand why it wasn't attacking. And then it shifted. The transformation happened in a single fluid motion that defied physics and reason, bones restructuring, for reseeding, form reshaping itself from beast to man in the span of a heartbeat. Where the wolf had stood, a man now knelt in the snow. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat that somehow hadn't torn during the shift, fitted perfectly to a body that radiated raw power like heat from a forge. His hair was black as the wolf had been, falling to his shoulders, and his face was all harsh angles and brutal elegance, the kind of masculine beauty that came with violence built into the bones. But it was his eyes that stole Rosalind's remaining breath. Still silver. Still glowing faintly. Still fixed on her with an attention that felt like being held in place by gravity itself. He moved to her side with efficient speed, gloved hands already reaching to check her pulse at her throat, his jaw tightening when his fingers found the weak flutter of her heartbeat. Up close, she could see the sharp intelligence in his gaze, the calculating way he assessed her injuries, the absolute control he maintained even as something that might have been anger flickered across his expression. "Who did this?" His voice was deep, rough-edged, the kind that carried authority without needing to shout. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was collecting information, building a picture, already planning his next move. Rosalind tried to answer. Tried to force words past her frozen lips, past the blood and the pain and the knowledge that she was seconds away from losing consciousness entirely. But nothing came out except a ragged exhale that sounded like giving up. The man's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer, studying her face with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. And then something shifted in his expression, recognition maybe, or realization, or something darker that Rosalind's dying brain couldn't quite parse. "Greymont," he said quietly. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered with the weight of someone who knew exactly what that name meant. "You're the Haltworth bride." The way he said it carried implications Rosalind didn't have the strength to untangle. But she saw his jaw clench. Saw his hands curl into fists against his thighs. Saw something that looked almost like decision warring with something that looked almost like mercy in those silver eyes. Any other alpha would have left her. Politics demanded it. The Greymounts were allied with the Haltworths through her arranged marriage. The Haltworths were enemies too. Rosalind's vision swam. She couldn't remember. Couldn't think through the cold and the pain and the way darkness kept trying to drag her under. But she knew, somehow, that this man was dangerous. Knew that whatever political web she'd been tangled in went deeper than she'd understood. Knew that being found by him, here, like this, meant something significant that she didn't have the capacity to process. The man stared at her for 3 more seconds. Then he stood, shrugging out of his coat with quick, decisive movements, and wrapped it around her broken body with surprising gentleness. The fabric was warm, impossibly warm, heated by his body temperature in a way that felt almost magical against her frozen skin. He scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest with one arm beneath her knees and one supporting her back, careful not to jostle her injuries. "I didn't find you," he said, his voice low and rough and carrying a promise that Rosalind's failing consciousness couldn't quite grasp, "just to watch you die." The last thing Rosalind saw before the darkness finally claimed her was the moon reflected in his silver eyes. And the last thing she heard was the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat as he carried her away from the snow. If you want to know what happens when a dying woman becomes the most dangerous weapon in the North, stay with me. Because this story? It's just beginning. Subscribe to Cindy's Wolfheart Stories. Because here, we don't just tell tales, we make you feel them in your bones. Rosalind woke to warmth. Not the harsh, burning kind that came with fever, though there was some of that too, pulsing beneath her skin in waves that made her teeth chatter. This was different. Gentle. Intentional. The kind of warmth that wrapped around you like careful hands, like someone had taken the time to build a cocoon specifically designed to keep death at bay. She could feel soft fabric against her skin, weight pressing down that wasn't crushing but grounding, and beneath it all, the steady crackle of a fire burning somewhere close. For a long moment, she didn't open her eyes. Didn't want to. Because opening her eyes meant confronting wherever she was, and Rosalind wasn't sure she had the strength for that yet. Her body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled incorrectly, every nerve ending screaming information her brain couldn't quite process. Her ribs throbbed with each breath. Her left arm was immobilized, wrapped in something that held it firm against her chest. Her legs felt distant and strange, there but not quite hers yet. And underneath all of it ran a deeper ache, the kind that came from bones that had broken and been forced back into alignment, tissue that had torn and was slowly knitting itself closed. She was alive. That realization hit her with unexpected force, bringing tears that leaked from beneath her closed eyelids and slid down her temples into her hair. She was alive. After the snow and the blood and the certainty of death, after Caspian's hands and the way the cold had burrowed so deep she'd stopped feeling anything at all, she was alive. Which meant someone had saved her. The memory returned in fragments, silver eyes in the moonlight, a massive black wolf, a man who'd knelt in the snow and looked at her like he was solving a complicated equation. A man who'd recognized her name and made a choice that went against every political instinct. "You're awake." The voice came from her left, low and calm and unsurprised. As if he'd been sitting there waiting for this exact moment, patient as stone. Rosalind's eyes snapped open, her heart lurching against her damaged ribs hard enough to make her gasp. Pain flared white-hot through her chest, and she couldn't stop the whimper that escaped her throat. "Don't move." The command was quiet but absolute, carrying the kind of authority that made disobedience feel impossible. "Your ribs are fractured in 3 places. Healers bound them, but they need time." Rosalind turned her head slowly, the only movement that didn't ignite fresh agony, and found him. He sat in a chair beside the bed, leaning back with deceptive casualness, one ankle crossed over the opposite knee. In the firelight, he was even more striking than he'd been in the snow, all brutal elegance and controlled power, dressed now in dark clothing that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. His black hair was tied back from his face, revealing the sharp cut of his cheekbones, the strong line of his jaw. But it was his eyes that held her captive. Still silver. Still luminous. Watching her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under glass, something fascinating and dangerous that required careful study. "Who are you?" Rosalind's voice came out wrecked, barely more than a rasp, her throat raw from screaming and cold and disuse. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "You don't know." "Would I ask if I did?" The corner of his mouth twitched. Almost a smile. "Almost. Fair enough." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, the movement bringing him closer to the bed. Close enough that Rosalind could see the flecks of darker silver in his eyes, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "Dorian Vale, Alpha King of the North, sovereign of Ravenfield Pack and the 7 territories that bend knee to my rule." The air left Rosalind's lungs in a rush that had nothing to do with her broken ribs. Dorian Vale. Every wolf in the North knew that name. Knew the stories that surrounded it like smoke, tales of a man who'd claimed the Alpha King title at 23 after defeating 7 challengers in a single night. A man who ruled with iron efficiency and strategic brilliance, who'd expanded Ravenfield's territory through a combination of tactical marriages, brutal warfare, and political maneuvering so elegant it was almost art. A man who'd been fighting a cold war with the Haltworth Pack for the better part of 5 years, a conflict of sabotage and proxy battles and carefully orchestrated moves that everyone knew would eventually culminate in open violence. A man who was supposed to be her husband's greatest enemy. "You should have left me to die." The words fell from Rosalind's mouth before she could stop them, blunt and graceless. But true. "Politically, I'm worth nothing to you alive. I'm Haltworth property now, or I would have been if." She couldn't finish that sentence. Couldn't say if Caspian hadn't tried to murder me aloud without tasting bile. Dorian's expression didn't change. "You're correct. Any reasonable strategist would have ridden past and let nature take its course." He paused, his silver gaze pinning her in place. "But I've never been accused of being reasonable when it comes to the Haltworths." There was something in the way he said it, something sharp and dark and weighted with history Rosalind didn't fully understand. She'd known the Packs were enemies. Known there was bad blood between them, generations of territorial disputes and political animosity. But the way Dorian spoke made it sound personal. Made it sound like the hatred ran deeper than politics and power. "So you saved me out of spite?" Rosalind heard the bitterness in her own voice, the exhaustion. Rescued the discarded bride just to rub it in Caspian's face? No. Dorian's voice remained level, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of something hotter, more dangerous. I saved you because leaving you there would have been a waste. And because he stopped abruptly, jaw tightening as if he was biting backwards, he decided not to share. Because what? He studied her for a long moment, and Rosalind had the distinct impression he was deciding how much truth to give her. How much honesty she could handle in her current state. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. More careful. Because I know what it looks like when the Haltworths decide someone is expendable. I've seen it before. And I'm tired of burying bodies they leave behind. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Rosalind wanted to ask who else he'd found. Wanted to know how many others had been thrown away like trash when they became inconvenient. But exhaustion was pulling at her again, making her eyelids heavy, and she had more immediate concerns. Where am I? Ravenfield Manor. North Wing, 3rd floor. Private quarters. Dorian gestured vaguely around the room, and Rosalind realized for the first time that she was in a space that radiated wealth and power, high ceilings, rich fabrics, furniture that was both elegant and functional. A room designed for important guests or family. You've been unconscious for 3 days while healers worked to stabilize your injuries. 3 days. The number rattled through Rosalind's mind, bringing with it a cascade of realizations. 3 days meant her father would have been notified. 3 days meant the wedding wouldn't have happened. 3 days meant Caspian would know she'd survived, and if he'd wanted her dead before. He'll come for me. The words came out flat, factual. Not a question, but a certainty. When Caspian finds out I'm alive, he'll come to finish what he started. Let him try. The response was immediate and carried enough threat to make Rosalind's pulse skip despite the pain medication making her thoughts fuzzy. Dorian's expression hadn't changed, still calm, still controlled, but something had shifted in the air around him. Something primal and absolutely lethal, the kind of presence that reminded you he hadn't claimed the Alpha King title through politics alone. You're under Ravenfield protection now, Dorian continued, his voice steady but edged with steel. No one touches you without going through me first. And I promise you, Rosalind Greymont, anyone foolish enough to try will regret that decision thoroughly. Rosalind stared at him, trying to reconcile the contradiction he presented. This man who'd saved her life, but spoke about her with strategic detachment. This man who promised protection while looking at her like she was a puzzle to be solved. This man who was supposed to be her enemy's enemy, which should have made him an ally, except nothing about this situation felt simple or safe. Why? The question came out smaller than she intended, more vulnerable. You said saving me wasn't reasonable. So why do it? Why bring me here, waste resources healing me, put yourself between me and the Haltworths? Why? Dorian was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere distant in the manor, footsteps moved along corridors. And those silver eyes never left her face, searching for something Rosalind couldn't identify. When he finally answered, his voice carried a weight that made her chest tight. Because you know something, don't you? He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. That's why Caspian threw you from that carriage. Not because the engagement ended, not because of some lover's quarrel. He tried to kill you because you discovered something he couldn't afford to have exposed. Rosalind's breath caught. Her mind flashed back to those ledgers, to pages filled with theft and corruption, to the moment she'd understood exactly what kind of man she'd almost married. The instinct to lie rose fast and sharp, deny everything, protect herself, don't give this dangerous stranger ammunition he could use against her. But the lies died on her tongue. Because Dorian was right. And because he'd already saved her life, already brought her into his territory, already positioned himself as her defender. Either he was playing a longer game than she understood, or he genuinely wanted to help. And right now, broken and vulnerable and 3 days past death, Rosalind didn't have the luxury of perfect options. Ledgers, she said quietly. I found ledgers in Caspian's study. Proof that the Haltworth pack has been stealing from their most vulnerable members for years. Funds meant for widows, orphans, injured omegas, all redirected to private accounts, used to buy influence and expand territory while people starved. Dorian's expression didn't change, but Rosalind saw his hands curl into fists where they rested on his knees. Saw the muscle jump in his jaw. Saw something that looked like vindication flash through those silver eyes. Can you prove it? His voice was carefully neutral, but underneath she heard the razor edge of interest. If you testified to the Grand Council, could you provide evidence specific enough to hold up under scrutiny? I memorized the account numbers, the dates, the amounts. Rosalind's voice strengthened slightly, some part of her finding solid ground in facts and figures. I can reconstruct the most damning transactions from memory. And if the ledgers still exist, I can tell you exactly where to find them. Dorian exhaled slowly, something that might have been satisfaction or might have been the release of tension he'd been holding for years. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed intensity. And when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, still controlled, still strategic, but carrying a thread of something that almost sounded like respect. You realize what you just gave me, don't you? What you represent? Rosalind's throat tightened. A weapon. The weapon, Dorian corrected. I've been fighting the Haltworths through proxies and politics for 5 years. 5 years of trying to expose their corruption, trying to undermine their influence, trying to build a case strong enough to bring them down without starting a war that would cost thousands of innocent lives. He paused, his silver eyes boring into hers. You're the living proof I've been waiting for. A first-hand witness with nothing to gain from lying, someone they tried to murder specifically to silence. You're not just evidence, Rosalind. You're the final blow I need to destroy them. The words should have frightened her. Should have made her feel used, manipulated, like she was trading one dangerous man for another. But instead, Rosalind felt something unexpected unfurling in her chest, something that tasted like purpose. What do you want from me? Dorian didn't hesitate. 6 weeks. That's how long until the Ashgam Gathering, the biggest political event of the season, when every major alpha and influential pack in the north comes together. It's neutral ground, overseen by the Grand Council, and it's the perfect stage for what needs to happen. Which is, you testify publicly. Present your evidence in front of 40 witnesses who can't be bribed or threatened. Expose the Haltworths for what they are and watch their empire crumble under the weight of their own corruption. Dorian's voice carried quiet satisfaction, but also something harder. Something that understood exactly what he was asking. But 6 weeks isn't much time. And you'll need to be more than just a witness. What do you mean? I mean Caspian and his father will do everything in their power to discredit you. They'll call you a liar, a scorned woman seeking revenge, an outsider trying to manipulate alpha politics. They'll attack your character, your credibility, your right to even speak. Dorian's expression softened fractionally, something that might have been concern entering his voice. You need to become someone they can't dismiss. Someone with power and position and protection so absolute that calling you a liar would be calling me a liar. Rosalind's heart was pounding now, understanding crystallizing even before he said it aloud. You need to become my mate. The words fell between them like stones into deep water, creating ripples that spread outward in ways Rosalind couldn't fully calculate. Her mind spun, trying to process what he was suggesting. Mate bonds were sacred among wolves, permanent, binding, intimate beyond measure. They weren't political arrangements to be negotiated. They were. Not a true bond, Dorian said quickly, reading her expression. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for a formal mating ceremony, marriage in human terms. Public binding, recognized by every pack in the north. You would become my alpha queen, protected by Ravenfield law and my personal authority. No one would dare call you a liar without calling into question my judgment. And when you testify against the Haltworths, you do it from a position of strength, not as a discarded bride, but as royalty. Rosalind stared at him, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and hope and calculation. And what do you get out of this arrangement? Exactly what I said. The weapon I need to destroy the Haltworths. A living witness who can't be silenced or dismissed. Dorian's silver eyes held hers steadily. I won't pretend this is altruism, Rosalind. I'm offering you protection and position because you're valuable to me strategically. But I'm also offering you the chance to make them pay for what they tried to do to you. To ensure no one else gets thrown in the snow because they knew too much. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. No pretty lies, no manipulation disguised as romance, no pretending this was anything other than what it was, a transaction. Power and protection in exchange for testimony and legitimacy. She would be using him exactly as much as he was using her. The difference was that Dorian was telling her the truth about it. 6 weeks, Rosalind repeated slowly. And after? After the gathering, after the Haltworths are exposed, what then? Something flickered in Dorian's expression, too fast for her to read, but it looked almost like uncertainty. That would be up to you. The mating bond can be dissolved through formal petition once the political necessity ends. You'd have options. Freedom. Resources. Whatever life you wanted to build. And if I say no, then I still protect you. Still heal you. Still ensure you're safe. Dorian's voice remained steady. But you'd be vulnerable, Rosalind. A target without position or power. The Haltworths would never stop coming for you. And I can promise protection, but I can't promise it would be enough if you're just another refugee under my roof rather than my acknowledged mate. The fire crackled. Rosalind's ribs ached with each breath. And she thought about Caspian's hands shoving her from the carriage, about the cold burrowing into her bones, about dying alone in the snow while the man she'd trusted smiled and rode away. She thought about all the widows and orphans who'd starved while their funds disappeared into Haltworth accounts. She thought about the kind of woman she'd been 3 days ago, naive enough to believe in appealing to conscience, soft enough to think truth alone would be sufficient. That woman had died in the snow. The woman who'd woken up in Ravenfield Manor was someone different. Someone harder. Someone who understood that mercy without power was just another word for weakness. Teach me, Rosalind said, her voice gaining strength. If I'm going to be your weapon, if I'm going to stand in front of the most powerful alphas in the north and destroy the Haltworths, teach me how to be someone they can't break. Teach me how to be a queen. Dorian's silver eyes flashed with something that looked like approval. Like recognition. Like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. He stood in one fluid movement, crossing to the bed, and extended his hand to her. Then we have 6 weeks to forge you into something unbreakable, he said quietly. And I promise you, Rosalind Greymont, when we're done, they'll regret every moment they underestimated you. Rosalind looked at his offered hand. At the man who should have been her enemy but had chosen to become her savior. At the Alpha King who was offering her everything she needed to survive and make them pay, even if his reasons were strategic rather than kind. She reached out with her good hand and took it. His grip was warm, steady, and absolutely certain. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing Ravenfield in white. But this time, Rosalind wasn't afraid of the cold. This time, she was going to learn how to become the storm. The first time Rosalind tried to stand, her legs gave out completely. It happened on day 6, after the healers had finally cleared her to attempt movement beyond shifting positions in bed. She'd been so certain she was ready, had felt the strength returning to her body in increments, felt the pain receding from unbearable to merely agonizing. She'd gritted her teeth and swung her legs over the side of the mattress with determination burning in her chest, planted her feet on the cool wooden floor, and pushed herself upright. She'd made it approximately 3 seconds before her knees buckled and she went down hard. The crash brought Dorian through the door at a dead run, moving with predatory speed that would have been frightening if Rosalind had any dignity left to feel frightened with. Instead, she just lay there on the floor in a tangle of nightgown and wounded pride, tears streaming down her face, not from the physical pain, though that was considerable, but from the sheer humiliation of it. From the reality that Caspian Hallworth had broken her so thoroughly that she couldn't even accomplish the basic task of standing on her own 2 feet. Dorian had lifted her back into bed without a word, his face carefully neutral, those silver eyes giving nothing away. But his hands had been gentle as he'd checked her over for new injuries, and when he'd finally spoken, his voice had carried a roughness that might have been anger except it didn't feel directed at her. Healing isn't linear. It doesn't care about your pride or your timeline. You push too hard, you'll set yourself back weeks. I don't have weeks, Rosalind had snapped back, hating how her voice broke. You said 6 weeks until the gathering. I can't walk up a flight of stairs, I can barely feed myself, and you want me to stand in front of the most powerful wolves in the north and convince them I'm worth listening to. You will. The certainty in his tone had cut through her spiral. Because you're not doing this alone. He'd been right about that, at least. The woman who appeared at Rosalind's door the next morning was someone Dorian introduced as Maven, head housekeeper of Ravenfield Manor, and Rosalind would learn so much more than that title implied. She was perhaps 60, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp cheekbones that could have cut glass, and dark eyes that saw entirely too much. She moved with military precision and spoke with the kind of authority that made even alphas straighten their spines. 6 weeks, Maven had said, looking Rosalind over with clinical assessment. His Majesty tells me I have 6 weeks to make you into a queen. Let's see what we're working with. What followed was the most grueling education of Rosalind's life. Maven was relentless. She showed up every morning at dawn with a schedule that left no room for self-pity or hesitation. Physical therapy to rebuild Rosalind's strength, exercises that left her shaking and nauseated but gradually, painfully, returned function to her damaged body. Etiquette lessons that went far beyond which fork to use at dinner, teaching instead the subtle art of social warfare, how to read a room, how to identify alliances and weaknesses, how to deliver a compliment that felt like a threat or a threat that sounded like a compliment. You were raised minor pack, Maven said bluntly on day 3, not unkindly but without softening the truth. Good family, decent education, but sheltered. Protected. You've never had to navigate real political waters, never had to watch your back at every social gathering, never learned that in the world of alpha politics, every smile hides a knife. She wasn't wrong. Rosalind had grown up in her father's estate on the edges of Greymont territory, a small holding, respectable but unremarkable. Her childhood had been comfortable in the way that came from being important enough to matter, but not important enough to be targeted. Her father managed timber rights and trade negotiations with human settlements. Her mother had died when Rosalind was 12, leaving behind a daughter who'd inherited her grace, but not her ability to shift. That had been the defining fact of Rosalind's existence. She'd never transformed. Most wolves experience their first shift in adolescence, a rite of passage that marked the transition from child to full pack member, when your wolf rose to the surface and you finally understood what it meant to run on 4 legs beneath the moon. Rosalind had waited for it at 13, then 14, then 15. Had felt the pull sometimes, that restless energy beneath her skin that suggested something wanted out. But the shift never came. The pack healers had examined her thoroughly, poking and prodding while she'd sat there burning with shame. They'd concluded she had some wolf blood enough to mark her as pack, enough to give her slightly enhanced healing and senses beyond human normal, but not enough for a full transformation. A genetic anomaly. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that made her less than. Except it did make her less than, at least in the eyes of wolves who measured worth by strength and dominance. Her father had called it a blessing, like she'd mentioned to herself before. One less vulnerability for enemies to exploit, he'd said, as if being unable to shift was somehow protective rather than isolating. You'll make a good match for a diplomatic alliance. Smart, pretty, controllable. That last word had stung worse than the rest combined. Controllable. Because that's what she'd been, wasn't she? Controlled. Shaped. Molded into exactly what others needed her to be. The perfect minor pack daughter who knew how to smile and stay quiet and never make waves. Who'd been thrilled when Caspian Haltworth, handsome, charming, heir to a major pack, had shown interest in her. Who'd believed his pretty words about building something better together, about being partners, about how he valued her mind as much as her bloodline. She'd been so easy to manipulate, so desperate to believe she could be important despite her inability to shift that she'd missed every red flag. Missed how Caspian's compliments always came with subtle corrections. Missed how his affection was doled out like rewards for good behavior. Missed the calculating coldness beneath his charming exterior because she'd wanted so badly to be chosen, to be valued, to matter to someone powerful. The shame of it ate at Rosalind during those first weeks at Ravenfield, gnawed at her in the quiet moments when Maven dismissed her for the day and she was left alone with her thoughts. She'd been such a fool. Such a naive, trusting fool. And it had nearly gotten her killed. Stop that. Rosalind looked up, startled. She hadn't heard Dorian enter the small study where she'd been attempting to read through reports on pack politics, another assignment from Maven designed to educate her on the landscape she'd be navigating. He stood in the doorway now, dressed simply in dark trousers and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking less like an alpha king and more like someone who'd just come from working in his study. Stop what? Torturing yourself. Dorian crossed to the chair opposite hers, settling into it with that same unsettling grace. You get a look on your face sometimes. Like you're cataloging every mistake you've ever made and assigning yourself blame for things you couldn't have predicted. Maybe I should. Rosalind's voice came out sharper than intended. I walked right into Caspian's trap. Believed every lie. Made myself into the perfect victim. No. The word was flat, absolute. He made himself into the perfect predator. There's a difference. Is there? Rosalind set down the report she'd been failing to concentrate on, frustration boiling over. Because from where I'm sitting, I handed him everything he needed to destroy me. I was weak. You were trusting, Dorian interrupted. And, before you tell me that's the same thing, it's not. Trust is what allows packs to function, communities to build, civilization to exist. Caspian weaponized something fundamental to who you are and twisted it into vulnerability. That doesn't make you weak. It makes him a monster. The vehemence in his voice surprised her. Dorian was usually so controlled, so carefully measured in everything he said and did. But right now, there was heat in those silver eyes, something that looked almost like personal offense at the way she was speaking about herself. You sound like you've given this speech before, Rosalind said quietly. Something shifted in Dorian's expression, a flicker of old pain, carefully suppressed, but not quite hidden. I have. To others the Haltworths destroyed. To wolves they used and discarded when convenient. You're not the first person Caspian has hurt, Rosalind. You're just the first one who survived long enough for me to do something about it. The words hung heavy between them. Rosalind wanted to ask who else he'd tried to save, who else the Haltworths had destroyed, what personal stake Dorian had in this war beyond political necessity. But before she could formulate the question, he was standing, moving toward the window with his hands clasped behind his back. Maven tells me you're making excellent progress, he said, his tone shifting back to something more neutral. She says you have a gift for reading people once you stop doubting yourself. Maven also says I fold too easily under pressure and apologize too much. She's right about the apologizing. Dorian glanced back at her, something that might have been amusement touching his features. You've said, I'm sorry, approximately 47 times since you arrived. Most of them for things that weren't your fault. I'm sore. Rosalind caught herself, snapping her mouth shut. Dorian's eyebrow rose incrementally, making his point without words. That's going to be harder to unlearn than I thought. Most worthwhile changes are. He turned fully to face her, leaning against the window frame. But you're doing it. Every day you're becoming someone different. Someone stronger. Someone harder, Rosalind corrected softly. I barely recognize myself anymore. Good. The single word was delivered without apology, without softening. Dorian's silver eyes held hers steadily, and there was something in his gaze that demanded she understand what he was saying. The woman you were before, the one Caspian threw from that carriage, she was good and kind and saw the best in people. And those are beautiful qualities, Rosalind. But they're also the qualities that nearly killed you. He paused, letting that sink in. The woman you're becoming can still be kind, can still choose mercy. But she understands that kindness without teeth is just another word for weakness. And she'll never let anyone mistake her compassion for something they can exploit. Rosalind felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, some knot of shame and self-recrimination that had been strangling her since she'd woken up in this manner. Dorian wasn't telling her to stop being angry at herself because anger was wrong. He was telling her to stop wasting time on shame and channel that energy into transformation instead. Teach me, she said, echoing the words she'd spoken that first night. Not just Maven's lessons. I want to learn how you do it, how you command a room, how you make people listen without raising your voice, how you look at someone and make them believe you see straight through them. Dorian studied her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes. Then he pushed off from the window frame and crossed to stand in front of her chair. He was tall enough that even with her sitting and him standing, the difference in their heights was significant. He could have used that to intimidate her, loomed over her, invaded her space, made her feel small. Instead, he crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. Power, he said quietly, isn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the most physically dominant. It's about certainty. When you speak with the absolute conviction that you have every right to be heard. When you enter a space, you move like you own it, not arrogantly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows their worth doesn't depend on anyone else's validation. His silver eyes held hers, and Rosalind found she couldn't look away. But the real secret? Dorian continued. The thing that makes people truly listen? You stop performing for them. Stop trying to prove yourself. Stop seeking approval. Stop caring whether they like you. Because the moment you stop needing their acceptance, you become dangerous. You become someone who can't be controlled by their opinions or manipulated by their judgment. And that a slight smile touched his mouth terrifies them. Rosalind felt her breath catch. It was the most honest, unvarnished advice anyone had ever given her about navigating power. No platitudes, no gentle encouragement. Just the raw truth of how authority actually worked. Show me, she whispered. Dorian's smile widened fractionally. Stand up. This time, when Rosalind pushed herself out of the chair, her legs held. They shook slightly, still weak, still rebuilding, but they held. Dorian stood with her, maintaining that intense eye contact. Walked to the door. Rosalind moved carefully, conscious of every step, every slight waver in her balance. When she reached the door, she turned back to face him. Now walk back. But this time, don't watch your feet. Don't check your balance. Eyes on me. Walk like you could do this in your sleep, like your body knows exactly what it's doing even if your mind has doubts. She took a breath and started forward. Her first instinct was to look down, to monitor her legs, to prepare for the possibility of falling. Instead, she forced her gaze up, locked onto Dorian's silver eyes, and walked toward him like she was completely certain of every step. Her legs still shook. Her balance still wavered slightly. But the overall effect was entirely different, less victim learning to move again, more predator testing newly healed muscles. Better, Dorian said when she stopped in front of him. Now tell me to leave. Rosalind blinked. What? You heard me. Order me out of this room. Use your voice like you have every expectation that I'll obey. It felt absurd. He was the Alpha King. This was his manner. She was a guest, a refugee, someone he was helping out of strategic necessity. The power dynamic was so skewed that the idea of ordering him anywhere was laughable. But that was exactly the point, wasn't it? Rosalind straightened her spine, lifted her chin, met those silver eyes with as much steel as she could muster. Leave. The word came out thin, uncertain. A request pretending to be a command. Dorian didn't move. Again. Lower. From your chest, not your throat. And stop making it a question. Rosalind tried again. Leave. Better. Once more. This time, believe it. Believe you have every right to demand my absence, that your word carries weight, that I should obey because you said so. She took a breath. Reached for that growing thing inside her, the anger, the determination, the woman who died in the snow and woken up hungry for justice. She let it fill her voice. Leave. The word cracked through the air with surprising force. Still not perfect, still carrying traces of the uncertainty she hadn't quite shed. But different. Harder. Edged with real authority. Dorian's eyes flashed with something that looked like triumph. There, he said softly. That's the woman who's going to destroy the Haltworths. Hold on to her. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving Rosalind standing in the middle of the study with her heart pounding and her hands shaking and the strangest sense that something fundamental had just shifted inside her. That she'd glimpsed for just a moment who she could become if she stopped apologizing for taking up space. At the doorway, Dorian paused and glanced back. You asked me once why I saved you, he said. I told you it was strategic. That you were a weapon I needed. He was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. But the truth is, when I found you in that snow, I saw something in your eyes. Even dying, even broken, you were still fighting. Still trying to breathe, still clinging to consciousness, still refusing to let go. His silver gaze held hers across the distance. That's not weakness, Rosalind. That's the most dangerous kind of strength there is. The kind that doesn't know how to quit. And I thought, if she survives this, if she makes it through, she's going to be extraordinary. He left before she could respond, the door closing softly behind him. Rosalind stood alone in the study, legs trembling slightly, tears pricking at her eyes for reasons she couldn't quite name. She'd spent so much time hating herself for being naive, for being trusting, for being the kind of woman who could be so easily manipulated. She'd cataloged every weakness, every failure, every moment of poor judgment that had led to her lying broken in the snow. But she'd never once given herself credit for surviving it. For taking Caspian's worst and refusing to let it be the end of her story. For waking up in a stranger's manor and choosing to become something fiercer rather than something softer. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Ravenfield territory, painting the snow gold and orange. Rosalind walked to the glass, still unsteady but stronger every day, and pressed her palm against the cool surface. Somewhere out there, Caspian Haltworth believed she was dead. Believed he'd silenced her permanently, erased the threat she represented. He was going to learn exactly how wrong he'd been. And Rosalind was going to enjoy every moment of his realization. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 weeks ago, the one who'd believed in appealing to conscience, in the fundamental decency of people, in the power of truth alone. That woman had been kind, gentle, good. That woman was gone. And the woman taking her place understood something crucial. Monsters like Caspian Haltworth didn't respond to kindness or appeals to their better nature. They responded to power, to consequences, to being beaten at their own game by someone who'd learned to play it better. Rosalind pressed her forehead against the window and made herself a promise. In 4 weeks, she'd walk into the Ashcombe gathering on Dorian Vale's arm. She'd stand in front of the most powerful wolves in the north wearing a crown and carrying herself like a queen. And she'd look Caspian Haltworth in the eyes while she destroyed everything he'd built with his lies and his cruelty. She'd do it for every widow who'd gone hungry because her funds disappeared. For every orphan who'd suffered because pack resources were stolen. For every vulnerable wolf who'd been deemed expendable by men who valued power over people. And she'd do it for herself, for the girl who'd almost frozen to death believing she was worthless. Because that girl deserved justice. And the woman she was becoming knew exactly how to deliver it. The dream came on the 21st night. Rosalind woke gasping, her nightgown soaked through with sweat despite the winter cold that pressed against the windows. Her heart hammered against her ribs, healed now mostly, though they still ached when the weather shifted. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Couldn't orient herself in the darkness. Could only feel the phantom sensation of falling, of cold air rushing past her face, of Caspian's hands on her shoulders. Except that wasn't what she'd been dreaming about. She'd been standing in a forest she didn't recognize, ancient beyond measure, trees so tall their canopies disappeared into mist, their trunks wider than houses. Silver light filtered through the branches, though there was no visible moon. And she'd been walking, her bare feet silent on moss-covered ground, drawn forward by something she couldn't name. A pull. A calling. Something that resonated in her bones like a tuning fork struck perfectly. Then she'd seen it. A shrine carved directly into the living rock of a cliff face, weathered stone covered in symbols she'd never learned but somehow understood. Old magic. The kind that predated modern pack structures, predated alpha hierarchies, predated everything wolves had built in the centuries since they'd learned to walk on two legs as easily as four. And standing before that shrine, bathed in silver light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A wolf. Not her. She still couldn't shift, still carried that absence like a hollow space beneath her sternum. But this wolf was massive, silver white with eyes that glowed like captured starlight. And when it had turned to look at her, when those luminous eyes had met hers across the dream distance, Rosalind had felt something crack open inside her chest. Recognition, maybe. Or destiny. Or something older and stranger that she didn't have words for. The wolf had opened its mouth, and a voice had poured out female, layered with harmonics that suggested multiple speakers, ancient and patient and absolutely certain. The silver flame remembers. The bloodline calls. She who was cast aside will rise crowned in frost and fury, and the old powers will wake to judge the unworthy. Then the dream had shattered, dumping Rosalind back into her body with a violence that left her shaking. She sat in the darkness of her room, trying to slow her breathing, trying to convince herself it was just stress. Just anxiety about the approaching gathering manifesting in cryptic imagery. Just her subconscious processing trauma and transformation through metaphor. Except it hadn't felt like just a dream. It had felt like a memory. Like prophecy. Like something reaching through time to mark her with attention she hadn't asked for and didn't understand. Rosalind was still sitting there, knees pulled to her chest, when soft footsteps approached her door. She tensed automatically. Weeks of training with Maven had honed her awareness to a razor's edge, but relaxed fractionally when she recognized the particular cadence of the walk. Dorian didn't knock. Simply opened the door and stepped inside, dressed in dark sleeping trousers and nothing else, his black hair loose around his shoulders. In the dim light filtering through her curtains, his eyes caught the ambient glow and reflected it back silver. "You screamed," he said quietly. No judgment in his voice. Just statement of fact. "The guards were about to break down your door when I stopped them." Rosalind hadn't realized she'd screamed. The knowledge that she'd been loud enough to bring guards running made embarrassment flush hot across her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." She caught herself before completing the apology, remembering Maven's lessons, remembering Dorian's count of how many times she'd apologized unnecessarily. She tried again. "I had a nightmare. I'm fine now." Dorian crossed to the chair beside her bed, the same one he'd occupied that first night when she'd woken up here, and settled into it with the ease of someone who'd done this before. Who'd sat vigil beside sickbeds and comforted the traumatized and knew how to be present without being overwhelming. Want to talk about it? Rosalind considered lying. Considered brushing it off as nothing important, as simple stress and trauma playing out in her sleeping mind. But something about the dream had left her unsettled in a way that went beyond fear. Left her feeling like she'd brushed against something significant that she couldn't quite grasp. There was a forest, she said slowly. Ancient. With a shrine carved into stone. And a wolf, silver-white, enormous. It spoke to me. She hesitated, then forced herself to continue. It said something about a silver flame remembering. About bloodlines calling. About someone cast aside rising crowned in frost and fury while old powers wake to judge the unworthy. The words sounded ridiculous spoken aloud. Melodramatic. Like something from a children's tale about legendary heroes, not something a grown woman should be taking seriously. But Dorian had gone very still. His silver eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made Rosalind's breath catch. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the undercurrent of something sharper beneath it. Something that might have been excitement or might have been concern. Describe the symbols. The ones on the shrine. Can you remember them? The question surprised her. Rosalind closed her eyes, reaching back into the dream, pulling up the image of weathered stone. Spirals, she said slowly. Interconnected, forming a pattern. And crescents? No, moon phases. New moon to full moon to new again, repeating. And in the center, something that looked like a flame except the lines were all wrong. Too angular. More like frost crystals forming the shape of fire. Dorian's voice had dropped even lower. Silver flame. The mark of the winterborn bloodline. Rosalind's eyes snapped open. What? Dorian leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his expression intense in the darkness. Tell me about your mother's family. Your maternal bloodline. What do you know about them? Not much. Rosalind's brow furrowed, trying to understand what he was asking. My mother was Clara Ashford before she married my father. Her family held territory in the far north, but they lost most of it in a territorial dispute when she was young. She came south to rebuild connections, met my father, married him. She died when I was 12. Ashford, Dorian repeated, something clicking behind his eyes. Not the original name, was it? Changed generations back to something that sounded more civilized. Less archaic. I don't know. Maybe? Rosalind was thoroughly confused now. Why does this matter? Instead of answering directly, Dorian stood. Get dressed. Something warm. We're going somewhere. Now? It's the middle of the night. Now. The command in his voice was absolute. Trust me, Rosalind. This is important. 15 minutes later, Rosalind found herself bundled in a heavy fur-lined cloak, following Dorian through the silent corridors of Ravenfield Manor. He moved with purpose, leading her down staircases she hadn't explored, through passages that grew progressively older, stone replacing polished wood, rough-hewn walls replacing elegant plasterwork. They were descending into the original structure, she realized. The ancient heart of the manor that predated its more civilized additions. Finally, Dorian stopped before a heavy wooden door bound with iron. He produced a key from somewhere, unlocked it, and gestured her through. Beyond lay a library. But not like any library Rosalind had seen before. This was something older, stranger, shelves carved directly into stone walls, holding volumes that looked like they might crumble if handled carelessly. The air smelled of old paper and mineral-rich earth and something else, something that made the fine hairs on Rosalind's arms stand on end. Magic. Old magic, woven into the very stones. Dorian moved through the space with the certainty of someone who'd spent considerable time here. He went directly to a specific shelf, running his fingers along spines until he found what he was looking for, a volume bound in dark leather, its cover embossed with symbols that made Rosalind's breath catch. The same symbols from her dream. Spirals. Moon phases. And in the center, that strange angular flame made of frost. Dorian carried the book to a table, opened it carefully, and began flipping through pages covered in dense handwriting, some portions printed, some clearly added by hand over centuries, notes layered upon notes. When he found what he wanted, he turned the book toward her. "Read this." Rosalind leaned over the page, squinting in the lamplight Dorian had lit. The text was old but legible, written in formal language that made it sound like mythology. In the time before alphas claimed dominion through strength alone, the Winterborn bloodline held territory through older bonds, pacts made with the land itself, with the ancient powers that predated wolf and human both. They were marked by silver flame, frost given life, winter's fury tempered by winter's mercy. Their daughters carried gifts the New Order could not understand and therefore feared. When the age of alphas rose, the Winterborn were scattered. Their gifts spread thin across generations, diluted through marriages meant to civilize what was considered too wild, too dangerous, too connected to magics the modern world rejected. The bloodline was deliberately fractured, its history erased, its daughters taught to believe their strangeness was weakness rather than power. But the old blood remembers. And when winter's greatest cruelty creates winter's greatest need, the silver flame will waken one who has known both rejection and resurrection. She will rise crowned in frost and fury, and the old powers will wake to judge the unworthy. Rosalind's hands were shaking. This is just mythology. Old stories. Your mother couldn't shift either, could she? Dorian's voice was gentle but insistent. And her mother before her. A pattern of women who carried wolf blood but couldn't transform. Women who were considered strange, other, slightly wrong. Rosalind wanted to deny it, but memory was rising, fragments she'd buried because they hurt too much to examine. Her mother standing in the garden during winter storms, face turned up to the sky, looking more at peace than she ever did indoors. The way ice crystals seemed to form intricate patterns on windows when her mother was near, designs too complex to be natural. The stories her mother had told her before bed, tales of ancient wolves who could command winter itself, who wore crowns of frost and spoke with the voice of the north wind. Stories her father had forbidden after her mother died, calling them dangerous nonsense that would only confuse a child. The Winterborn bloodline was deliberately destroyed, Dorian continued, watching her face carefully, because their gifts represented a threat to the new power structure. Alphas rule through dominance, through force, through hierarchies built on who can win a physical challenge. But the Winterborn didn't need dominance. They had something older. Something that couldn't be beaten in combat because it wasn't about combat at all. What was it about? Rosalind's voice came out barely above a whisper. Balance. Justice. The land itself recognizing worthiness. Dorian's silver eyes held hers. The silver flame doesn't judge by strength. It judges by character. By whether someone uses power to build or destroy, to protect or exploit. And those found unworthy, he paused significantly, burn. Rosalind felt dizzy. This was too much. Too strange. She was just a minor pack daughter who couldn't shift, who'd been naive enough to almost marry a monster, who'd gotten lucky enough to be rescued by an alpha king with strategic interests. She wasn't special. Wasn't descended from some legendary bloodline. Wasn't connected to old magic and ancient prophecies. Except she remembered the dream with crystalline clarity. Remembered the way the silver wolf's eyes had looked at her with recognition. Remembered the pull she'd felt toward that shrine, like something in her bones responding to a call she didn't know she'd been waiting for. And she remembered something else, something that happened the night Caspian threw her from the carriage. In that moment before she'd lost consciousness completely, before the cold had taken her, She'd felt something ignite in her chest. Just for an instant, barely a flicker, but unmistakable. Heat in the middle of freezing. Silver light behind her closed eyelids. And the absolute certainty that if she'd had one more second, one more breath, something inside her would have erupted. She'd dismissed it as dying hallucination. Oxygen deprivation creating false sensations. But what if it hadn't been? I don't know how to access it, Rosalind said quietly. If this is real, if I do carry this bloodline, I don't know how to make it wake up. I can't even shift into a normal wolf. How am I supposed to? You don't shift, Dorian interrupted gently. That's the point. The Winterborn never shifted the way other wolves do. Their transformation was different. Deeper. They didn't become the wolf, they became winter itself. He stood, crossing to another shelf, returning with what looked like a journal, newer than the ancient tome, perhaps only a century old. He flipped it open to a page marked with ribbon. This is from my great-grandmother. She was a historian, obsessed with documenting bloodlines and lost gifts. She believed the Winterborn would return eventually, that power like that doesn't just disappear, it goes dormant, waiting. Rosalind read the passage he indicated, written in elegant script. The mark of awakening comes through extremity. The Winterborn gifts surface only when the carrier experiences winter's true nature, not the season, but the concept. Death and resurrection. The moment when everything is stripped away and you're reduced to absolute essentials. When you face annihilation and somehow, impossibly, survive. The old blood recognizes that threshold, and crossing it changes you fundamentally. Makes you into something the modern world has forgotten how to see. You died in the snow, Dorian said softly. Or close enough that it should have been permanent. Your body experienced winter's full cruelty, the stripping away, the reduction to nothing, the edge of annihilation. And then you came back. You crossed the threshold. But I don't feel different. Even as Rosalind said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. She did feel different. Had been attributing it to trauma and transformation, to Maven's training and Dorian's lessons. But underneath all that, there was something else. Something that had been growing quietly since she'd woken up in this manner. A presence beneath her sternum, patient and cold and waiting. You haven't claimed it yet, Dorian said. Haven't acknowledged it. The Winterborn gifts don't force themselves on their carriers, they wait to be accepted. They wait until you're ready to understand what they mean. Rosalind looked down at the ancient book, at the symbol of silver flame, at the prophecy about someone cast aside rising crowned in frost and fury. She thought about the dream. About the pull she'd felt toward that shrine. About the way winter no longer frightened her the way it once had. How she'd stood at her window during recent snowstorms and felt something almost like kinship rather than fear. She thought about standing in front of the Ashcombe gathering in 3 weeks, facing down the Haltworths, needing every advantage she could muster. If this is real, she said slowly, if I do carry this bloodline and these gifts, what does it mean? Practically. What can I actually do with it? Dorian's expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the calculation behind his eyes. I don't know exactly. The historical records are fragmentary, and no one's seen an active Winterborn in generations. But the text's suggestibilities connected to winter itself, command over ice and snow, enhanced perception during cold, the ability to literally freeze enemies in their tracks. And more than that, he paused, choosing his words carefully. The texts say the silver flame could reveal truth. That it burned away lies and deceptions, forced people to show their true nature whether they wanted to or not. Rosalind's breath caught. A power that revealed truth. That stripped away careful masks and political doublespeak and forced honesty into spaces built on manipulation. If she could do that, if she could stand before the gathered alphas and literally force the Haltworths to reveal their corruption, make it impossible for them to lie or deflect or charm their way out of consequences. I want to try, she said suddenly. Whatever ritual or practice or meditation would help me access this, I want to try. Dorian studied her for a long moment. It won't be easy. The text suggests the awakening process is intense. Painful, even. You'd be confronting parts of yourself you've spent your whole life suppressing, acknowledging power you were taught to fear. I don't care. Rosalind's voice was steady. I've spent 23 years being told I was less than because I couldn't shift. Being pitted or dismissed or treated like I was broken. If there's even a chance that what I am isn't weakness, but something else entirely, something powerful enough to make the Haltworths face consequences, I'm taking it. Something that looked like approval flashed through Dorian's silver eyes. Then we start tomorrow. There's a place, a sacred grove about an hour's ride north of here. Old Winterborn territory, or what's left of it. If your blood is going to wake anywhere, it'll be there. He closed the ancient book carefully, handling it with reverence. But Rosalind, you need to understand something. If this works, if the silver flame wakes in you, there's no going back. You won't just be playing the role of Alpha Queen anymore. You'll be something the modern wolf world doesn't have context for. Something that makes even alphas nervous, because you represent power they can't dominate or control. Good, Rosalind said simply. Let them be nervous. Let them wonder what I'm capable of. Let the Haltworths lie awake at night trying to calculate how to defend against something they don't understand. She stood, moving to the window of the underground library, though there was nothing to see but stone. But she could feel the winter beyond the walls, the snow falling soft and steady, the cold that had almost killed her and somehow, impossibly, given her something back. The woman who almost froze to death in that snow was weak, she said quietly. She believed in appealing to conscience and trusting in basic decency. She thought truth alone would be enough. Rosalind turned back to face Dorian, and her voice hardened. But I'm not her anymore. And if Winter itself wants to give me the weapons I need to burn the Haltworths down, I'll take them. Dorian's smile was small but genuine. Spoken like a true Winterborn. He gathered the books, preparing to return them to their shelves. But before he did, he paused, looking at Rosalind with an expression she couldn't quite read. My great-grandmother wrote something else in her journals. About why the Winterborn were truly dangerous to the Alpha Order. He was quiet for a moment, then continued. She said they couldn't be bought. Couldn't be threatened or dominated or controlled through the usual means. Because their power didn't come from pack bonds or territorial strength, it came from being aligned with something fundamental. Winter doesn't negotiate. Winter doesn't compromise. Winter simply is impartial, absolute, inevitable. He met her eyes across the lamplight. That's what you'll become if this works. Not someone who fights within the system, but someone who stands outside it entirely. Someone who can look at centuries of alpha politics and hierarchy and say none of this matters to me and mean it. Someone who answers to older laws than the ones modern wolves have built. Rosalind felt something settle in her chest, certainty, maybe, or recognition of what she'd been moving toward since the moment she'd accepted Dorian's proposal. 3 weeks, she said. We have 3 weeks until the Ashcam gathering. That's enough time. To fully master abilities no one's used in generations? No. Dorian's voice was pragmatic. But to wake them? To give you enough control that you can use them strategically when it matters most? Maybe. If you're willing to push harder than you've ever pushed before. I am. Then we start at dawn. Dorian moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be difficult in ways you're not prepared for. After he left, Rosalind stood alone in the underground library for several more minutes, surrounded by ancient texts and old magic and the weight of a heritage she'd never known she carried. The dream felt less like nightmare now and more like invitation. Like something in her blood waking up and asking if she was ready to remember what her ancestors had forgotten. She thought about the silver wolf with starlight eyes. About frost taking the shape of flame. About old powers waking to judge the unworthy. And she thought about Caspian Haltworth's face when he realized the woman he'd tried to murder had become something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Rosalind smiled in the darkness. Winter was coming. And she was finally learning how to be the storm. The grove was older than memory. Rosalind felt it the moment they crossed into the clearing, a shift in the air, in the quality of silence, in the way winter itself seemed to press closer with something almost like curiosity. The trees here were ancient beyond measure, their trunks thick as small houses, their branches bare and skeletal against a sky the color of old silver. Snow covered everything in pristine white, undisturbed except for the tracks Dorian's horse and her own left behind. But it was the stones that made her breath catch. 7 of them, arranged in a circle at the clearing's center, each taller than a man, covered in symbols she recognized from the ancient texts. Spirals, moon phases, and carved deep into the central stone, large enough to be visible even from a distance, the angular flame of frost that marked this place as Winterborn. "This is what's left," Dorian said quietly, dismounting with fluid grace. "There was a temple once, according to the records. A whole complex dedicated to training those who carried the bloodline. But it was destroyed during the Consolidation Wars, when the new Alpha Order was establishing dominance. They couldn't allow competing power structures to exist." He helped Rosalind down from her horse, his hands steady on her waist even though she'd grown strong enough these past weeks to manage the dismount herself. She was grateful for the contact anyway, something grounding when everything else felt like it was tilting sideways. "What do I do?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended, tension making her throat tight. Dorian studied her face, his silver eyes unreadable. "The texts aren't specific about methodology. They talk about meditation, about opening yourself to winter's lessons, about confronting the parts of yourself you've buried. But they don't give step-by-step instructions. So we're improvising. We're trusting that your blood knows what to do, even if your conscious mind doesn't." He gestured toward the central stone. "Go stand there, where this symbol is carved." And then he paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Stop fighting." "Stop fighting what?" "Everything." Dorian's voice was surprisingly gentle. "The cold, the fear, the part of you that still believes you're broken because you can't shift the way other wolves do. All the walls you've built to protect yourself from feeling too much. Let them down. Let winter in completely, and see what happens." It sounded terrifying and simple and impossible all at once. Rosalind walked toward the central stone on legs that felt steadier than they had any right to, given what she was about to attempt. The snow crunched beneath her boots. Her breath clouded the air. And as she got closer to that carved flame, she felt something respond in her chest, a flutter, a spark, a presence that had been sleeping finally stirring awake. She stopped before the stone, pressing her bare hand against the frost-covered symbol. The cold bit into her palm immediately, sharp and clarifying. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, heat. Not from the stone, but from inside her. Starting as a pinpoint behind her sternum and spreading outward in waves that made her gasp. Not burning exactly, but intense, like standing too close to a forge, except the forge was inside her own body. The carved symbol beneath her palm began to glow faintly, silver light bleeding through centuries of weathering. "Rosalind." Dorian's voice came from behind her, careful and watchful. "Whatever you're feeling, don't pull away from it. Lean into it." She closed her eyes, took a breath, and let the walls fall. Immediately, memory crashed over her like a physical force, not her own memories, but older ones, carried in blood and bone. She saw women who looked like her standing in this same clearing, power crackling around them like lightning, winter itself bending to their will. She saw them calling storms, freezing enemies mid-charge, speaking with voices that carried the authority of glaciers and avalanches. She saw them judging disputes with perfect impartiality, the silver flame revealing truth so clearly that lies became impossible. And she saw them destroyed, hunted, scattered. Their daughters taught to hide their gifts, to suppress their power, to blend into the new order and pretend they were just normal wolves who happened not to shift. Generation after generation of deliberate forgetting, of survival through concealment, of power buried so deep it became myth. Until there was nothing left but strange daughters who couldn't transform and bloodlines that had forgotten what they truly were. The grief of it hit Rosalind like a fist to the chest. All that power, all that potential, deliberately erased because it threatened men who wanted dominance to be the only currency that mattered. Because the Winterborn had represented something the Alpha Order couldn't control, judgment that didn't care about strength or territorial claims or political hierarchies. Justice that was absolute and impartial and completely indifferent to power. They'd had to be destroyed because they couldn't be dominated. And Rosalind carried their blood. The heat in her chest intensified, becoming almost painful. She could feel something trying to break free, something that had been caged her entire life finally straining against bars that were crumbling. The silver light beneath her palm grew brighter, and frost began forming on her skin in intricate patterns that looked less like frozen water and more like living art. That's it. Dorian's voice was closer now, though she hadn't heard him approach. Don't fight it. Let it. The sound of hoofbeats shattered the moment. Multiple riders, moving fast, the rhythm of their approach aggressive and purposeful. Rosalind's eyes snapped open, the connection to whatever she'd been touching fracturing instantly. The silver light died. The frost on her skin melted, and the heat in her chest banked to embers, leaving her feeling simultaneously more awake than she'd ever been and frustrated beyond measure. Dorian was already moving, positioning himself between Rosalind and the tree-line where the riders would emerge. His hand rested on the knife at his belt, not drawn yet, but ready. And his posture had shifted from teacher to warrior in the space of a heartbeat, power rolling off him in waves that made the air itself feel heavy. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "And don't speak unless I tell you to." 3 wolves burst from the trees, shifting mid-run into human form with practiced ease. They landed on 2 feet already dressed, magic or preparation, Rosalind couldn't tell, and strode forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that marked them as alphas or alpha-adjacent. 2 men and 1 woman, all carrying themselves like violence waiting for an excuse. The woman stepped forward, and Rosalind recognized her immediately from the extensive briefing materials Maven had made her study. Kira Thornwood, Alpha of the Silver Edge Pack, one of the neutral territories that held significant political sway in the north. She was perhaps 40, with sharp features and dark hair streaked with silver, dressed in practical riding clothes that still managed to look elegant. Alpha King. Kira's voice was cool, controlled, carrying the particular tone of someone who knew exactly how dangerous this conversation could become. Interesting place for a morning ride. Thornwood. Dorian's response was equally controlled, giving nothing away. I could say the same. This grove is in Ravenfield territory. Uninvited visitors tend to make me curious about their intentions. We came to speak with you. Your guards at the manor said you'd ridden north. Kira's dark eyes flicked to Rosalind, assessing her with the kind of thorough evaluation that felt invasive. Though I see you brought company. The Greymont girl. Or should I say, the Haltworth bride. The emphasis on that last word was deliberate, carrying implications that made Rosalind's jaw tighten. But Dorian had told her not to speak, so she remained silent, watching the exchange with the careful attention Maven had trained into her. Rosalind Greymont is under my protection, Dorian said, his tone flat and brooking no argument. Her status is no longer tied to the Haltworths in any capacity. So we've heard. One of the men stepped forward, broader than Dorian, younger, with the kind of aggressive energy that suggested he'd challenge anyone who looked at him wrong. Word is you've made quite a claim. That you're planning to take her as your mate. You're Alpha Queen. My intentions are my own business. They stop being your business when they affect the political stability of the entire North, Kira cut in sharply. The Haltworths are calling for a formal inquiry. They're claiming you kidnapped their betrothed, that you've been holding her against her will, possibly coercing her into false testimony against them. Rosalind felt fury spike hot and sharp in her chest. Of course. Of course Caspian would twist the narrative, make himself the victim, paint Dorian as the aggressor and her as the helpless damsel being manipulated by a powerful man. It was exactly the kind of move that would work with wolves who valued appearances and political convenience over truth. And you believe them? Dorian's voice had gone quieter, which somehow made it more dangerous. You think I need to kidnap and coerce women? I think you've been looking for an excuse to destroy the Haltworths for 5 years, Kira said bluntly. And I think a discarded bride with a grudge and convenient accusations is exactly the kind of weapon you'd use if it presented itself. The words hit too close to what Dorian himself had said, that Rosalind was the weapon he'd been waiting for, the final blow he needed. But hearing it from Kira's mouth, delivered with such casual cynicism, made it sound dirty. Made it sound like Rosalind had no agency in this, like she was just a tool being wielded by a more powerful player. Ask her yourself. Dorian gestured toward Rosalind without taking his eyes off the Silver-Edge wolves. She's standing right here, perfectly capable of speaking for herself. It was a test, Rosalind realized. Not just for Kira, but for her. Dorian was giving her permission to break his earlier command, to step forward and defend herself. He was trusting that Maven's training and his own lessons had prepared her for exactly this moment, being challenged by hostile alphas who wanted to see her crack. Rosalind took a breath and stepped out from behind Dorian, moving to stand beside him rather than cowering in his shadow. She kept her spine straight, her chin up, and met Kira's skeptical gaze with as much steady confidence as she could muster. I wasn't kidnapped, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the clearing without needing to shout. I was rescued. There's a significant difference. Rescued from what? The aggressive male alpha's tone dripped with false concern. From a betrothal you'd agreed to? From a powerful pack that would have given you status and security? From being murdered? Rosalind let the words hang in the cold air for a beat, watching them land. Caspian Haltworth threw me from a moving carriage 3 weeks ago and left me to die in the snow because I'd discovered evidence of his pack's corruption. Alpha King Dorian found me by chance and chose mercy. That's the truth, regardless of what narrative the Haltworths are spinning. Kira's expression hadn't changed, but something flickered in her eyes, doubt, maybe, or calculation. That's quite an accusation. It's quite a true one. Rosalind forced herself to hold eye contact, to not look away or down or display any of the submissive behaviors that would mark her as weak. And I'll be presenting evidence to support it at the Ashcombe gathering in 3 weeks, in front of every alpha and council member who wants to hear it. If you're alive in 3 weeks, the woman said softly. The threat was barely veiled. Rosalind felt Dorian tense beside her, felt the dangerous shift in his energy that suggested he was about to do something violent. But she spoke before he could, keeping her voice level even though her heart was hammering. Are you threatening me, Alpha Thornwood? Because that seems unwise, given that I'm under Ravenfield protection and standing beside the Alpha King of the North. I'm stating facts. Kira's smile was cold. The Haltworths have many allies. Many people who benefit from the current political structure and wouldn't appreciate someone trying to destabilize it with convenient accusations. Accidents happen, especially to young women who insert themselves into conflicts beyond their understanding. The casual cruelty of it made Rosalind's blood boil. This woman wasn't even denying the possibility that the Haltworths were corrupt, she just didn't care. Because maintaining the political status quo mattered more than justice. Because powerful packs being held accountable would set precedents that made all of them nervous. Let me be absolutely clear. Rosalind took a step forward, and something in her voice had changed, had gone harder, colder, carrying an edge that surprised even her. I'm not inserting myself into anything. Caspian Haltworth tried to kill me because I discovered he's been stealing from the most vulnerable members of his pack for years. I will testify to that at the gathering. And anyone who tries to stop me, she paused, letting her gaze sweep across all three Silver-Edge wolves, will discover that I'm significantly more difficult to kill than they anticipated. The frost patterns from earlier were forming again on her hands, just faintly, barely visible, but there. She could feel the cold presence in her chest stirring, responding to her anger, to the threat these wolves represented. Not fully awake yet, not under her control, but definitely present. Definitely aware. Kira's eyes dropped to Rosalind's hands, and for the first time, genuine uncertainty crossed her features. "What are you?" "Tired of being underestimated," Rosalind said simply. The silence that followed was taut as a drawn bowstring. The Silver-Edge wolves exchanged glances, clearly recalculating, trying to figure out what they'd walked into. This hadn't gone the way they'd expected. They'd come to intimidate a frightened girl and found something else entirely. Finally, Kira spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "The Haltworths have formally requested a pre-gathering meeting." Neutral ground. They want to address these accusations privately before they become public spectacle. No. Dorian's refusal was immediate and absolute. "You haven't heard their terms." "I don't need to." Dorian's silver eyes were hard as winter steel. "The Haltworths don't want a private meeting to address accusations. They want an opportunity to intimidate or silence Rosalind before she can speak publicly." "The answer is no." "Then you're choosing war," the aggressive male said flatly. "The Haltworths have allies. Pack bonds going back generations. If you force this into public confrontation without giving them a chance to defend themselves privately, they had their chance to defend themselves when they were stealing from widows and orphans." Rosalind's voice cut across his. "They had their chance when Caspian could have admitted what he'd done and tried to make it right instead of trying to murder me. They've had 5 years of chances while they consolidated power built on corruption. They don't get another one." She felt Dorian's approval without him saying a word, felt the way he shifted slightly closer to her in a gesture of support that wouldn't be lost on the watching wolves. Kira studied them both for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted, less threatening, more calculating. "You realize what you're starting, don't you? The Haltworths won't go down quietly. They'll fight with everything they have, politically, socially, and if necessary, physically. And there are packs who will support them, either out of loyalty or self-interest or simply because they don't want to see the existing order challenged." "I know exactly what I'm starting," Dorian said quietly. "I've been preparing for this fight for 5 years. The only thing that's changed is that now I have the evidence to win it. And you?" Kira's gaze locked on Rosalind. "Are you prepared for what's coming? For having the most powerful wolves in the North pick apart every aspect of your life, trying to find weaknesses they can exploit? For being called a liar and a manipulator and worse to your face while dozens of alphas watch?" Rosalind thought about the woman she'd been before the snow, the one who would have crumbled under that kind of pressure, who would have apologized for causing trouble and backed down to keep peace. That woman was gone. Burned away by winter and resurrected as something harder. "I'm not going to lie and say I'm not afraid," she said honestly. "But I've already been thrown from a carriage and left to die. I've already survived the worst Caspian Haltworth could do to me. Whatever comes next, I'll face it." Something that might have been respect flickered across Kira's face. "Then I suppose we'll see you at the gathering." She turned to leave, gesturing for her companions to follow. But before mounting her horse, she looked back one more time. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I hope you're telling the truth. Because if you are, if the Haltworths really are that corrupt, they deserve to burn. But if you're lying, if this is just revenge dressed up as justice," her dark eyes hardened, "you'll wish Caspian had finished the job in the snow." Then they were gone, horses thundering back through the trees, leaving Rosalind and Dorian alone in the ancient grove. The silence that settled was heavy with implications neither of them spoke aloud immediately. Rosalind's hands were shaking, not from fear, though that was present, but from the adrenaline of confrontation, from standing her ground against hostile alphas and not backing down. That was well done, Dorian said quietly. That was terrifying. Rosalind's voice shook slightly despite her attempts to control it. They're going to fight us every step of the way, aren't they? It's not going to be enough to just present evidence. We're going to have to battle for every inch of ground. Yes. Dorian didn't try to soften it. Kira's right about one thing: the Haltworths have allies. Packs who benefit from the current system, who don't want to see powerful families held accountable because it might set precedents that affect them. We're not just fighting the Haltworths. We're fighting everyone who has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Rosalind looked down at her hands, where the frost patterns had faded again. So close. She'd been so close to touching whatever power lived in her blood before the Silveridge wolves had interrupted. And now that moment was gone, the connection broken, and she didn't know if she could recapture it. We should go back, she said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. Try again another day when we're less likely to be interrupted. But Dorian was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between assessment and decision. No, he said slowly. I think you just proved something more important than accessing your Winterborn gifts. What? That you don't need ancient power to be dangerous. Dorian's silver eyes held hers steadily. You faced down 3 hostile alphas, held your ground, made them doubt themselves. You did that with nothing but conviction and courage. That's the weapon that's going to destroy the Haltworths, Rosalind. Not silver flame or winter magic, you. The woman who refuses to be silenced. His words settled over her like a mantle, heavy with truth she was only beginning to understand. She'd spent so much time thinking she needed to become something else, something powerful enough to match the Haltworths, that she'd missed the fact that transformation had already happened. The woman standing in this clearing was already someone different. Someone stronger. Someone who'd looked at 3 alphas trying to intimidate her and hadn't flinched. They're going to keep coming, Rosalind said quietly. Between now and the gathering. They're going to try everything they can to stop me from testifying. I know. Dorian's voice was grim. Which is why from this moment forward, you don't leave Ravenfield Manor without me. No exceptions. No matter how safe something seems. We have 3 weeks to get you to that gathering alive, and I'm not taking any chances. Rosalind nodded, understanding the necessity even as part of her chafed against the restriction. But she also understood that Dorian was right. She'd become too valuable, too dangerous to the existing power structure. The Haltworths and their allies would do whatever they could to silence her before she could speak publicly. They mounted their horses in silence, Rosalind casting one last look at the ancient stones before they left the grove. The Winterborn power might be dormant still, might take longer to access than they had time for. But as she followed Dorian back through the snow-covered forest, she realized something important. She didn't need ancient magic to fight the Haltworths. She just needed to survive long enough to tell the truth. And she would. She'd survived being thrown from a carriage, survived dying in the snow, survived 3 weeks of grueling transformation from naive bride to something infinitely more dangerous. She could survive 3 more weeks. And then she would stand in front of every powerful wolf in the north and watch Caspian Haltworth's world burn. Winter was patient. And so was she. The fire crackled softly in Dorian's private study, casting amber light across leather-bound books and maps of territories Rosalind was only beginning to understand. She shouldn't be here, it was nearly midnight, and Maven would scold her tomorrow about proper rest before the gathering. But sleep felt impossible with only 2 weeks remaining, with the weight of what was coming pressing down like physical force. She'd found herself walking these corridors, restless and anxious, and somehow ended up outside Dorian's door. He'd opened it before she could knock, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting her. Now they sat in comfortable chairs before the fire, glasses of amber liquid warming in their hands. Whiskey, he'd said, from his family's private reserve. The kind of thing you shared with people you trusted. Tell me about them, Rosalind said quietly. The others the Haltworths destroyed. You said I wasn't the first. Dorian was silent for a long moment, firelight playing across his features, making the sharp angles of his face seem almost vulnerable. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. My sister, Lyra. She was 18 when she met Caspian at a diplomatic gathering. He courted her the way he courted you, charming, attentive, making her feel special. Making her believe he saw something in her beyond political advantage. His jaw tightened. She discovered he was running illegal fighting rings, forcing Omegas to battle for entertainment, betting on their suffering. When she threatened to expose him, he arranged an accident. Her horse spooked on a mountain trail. She fell. Rosalind's chest constricted. Did she? She survived the fall. Barely. But the healers couldn't fix everything. She lost her ability to shift, lost most of her mobility, lost herself. Dorian's silver eyes stared into the fire, seeing something Rosalind couldn't. She took her own life 6 months later. Left a letter saying she couldn't bear being broken. Dorian, Rosalind reached out instinctively, her hand covering his where it gripped the chair arm. He looked down at their joined hands, something shifting in his expression. That's when I understood what the Haltworths really were. Not just political rivals, but genuinely evil. They don't just defeat opponents, they destroy souls. And I swore I'd make them pay for what they did to Lyra. For what they've done to countless others who never had the resources to fight back. Is that why you saved me? Because I reminded you of her? No. Dorian turned his hand, lacing his fingers through hers with surprising gentleness. I saved you because you deserve saving. Because leaving you there would have made me complicit in their cruelty. And because he paused, his thumb brushing across her knuckles, because when I looked in your eyes, even dying, you were still fighting. Lyra gave up. You didn't. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, snow fell in thick silence, wrapping Ravenfield Manor in winter's embrace. I'm afraid, Rosalind admitted quietly. Not of the gathering itself, but of failing. Of standing up there and not being enough. Of them winning anyway because I'm still just. Stop. Dorian's voice was firm but not harsh. He shifted closer, his free hand reaching up to cup her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. You're not just anything. You are the woman who survived attempted murder and chose to become a weapon instead of a victim. You are brilliant and brave and absolutely terrifying when you stop doubting yourself. You see me differently than I see myself. Then start seeing yourself through my eyes. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, the touch achingly gentle. Because from where I'm standing, you're extraordinary. The space between them felt charged, electric. Rosalind's breath caught as Dorian leaned closer, his gaze dropping to her mouth. This was dangerous territory. They'd agreed their mating bond was strategic, political, nothing more. Getting emotionally entangled would complicate everything. But right now, with firelight and honesty between them, Rosalind couldn't remember why that mattered. If we do this, she whispered, if we cross this line, then we cross it. Dorian's voice was rough, certain. I'm tired of pretending you're just strategy. Tired of acting like you don't make me feel things I haven't felt since. He stopped, jaw tightening. Since I stopped believing anyone could be trusted with the parts of myself I keep hidden. His silver eyes blazed. You scare me, Rosalind. Not because you're weak, but because you make me want things I gave up on years ago. Before she could respond, he closed the distance between them, his mouth capturing hers in a kiss that was nothing like she'd imagined. Not gentle or tentative, hungry, desperate, like he'd been holding back for weeks and finally allowed himself to break. Rosalind responded without thinking, her hands sliding into his dark hair, pulling him closer as heat exploded through her body. This was reckless. Complicated. Everything they'd agreed to avoid. And she didn't care. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, Dorian pressed his forehead against hers. Tell me to stop. Tell me this is a mistake and I'll walk away right now. We can pretend this never happened and keep everything professional. Rosalind thought about safety, about keeping emotions separate from strategy, about all the logical reasons this was dangerous. Then she thought about how his hand still cradled her face like she was something precious. How he'd shared his deepest pain with her. How he looked at her like she was worth protecting not because she was useful, but because she mattered. I don't want you to stop, she said simply. I want this. Want you. Consequences and complications and all. Something fierce and possessive flashed through Dorian's eyes. Then you have me. For as long as you want me. He kissed her again, slower this time, deliberate. And Rosalind let herself fall into it, into him, knowing this changed everything and not caring. Because some things were worth the risk. Some connections were worth fighting for. Even in the middle of a war. The message arrived 3 days before the gathering. Rosalind found it on her breakfast tray, an elegant envelope sealed with wax, her name written in familiar handwriting that made her stomach drop. She knew that script. Had seen it on love letters and broken promises. Caspian. Her hands shook as she broke the seal, Maven watching from across the room with sharp concern. The letter inside was brief. Rosalind, I know what you're planning. I know you believe I tried to kill you. You're wrong. Meet me at the old chapel on neutral ground, 1 hour before the gathering begins. Come alone. Let me explain what really happened that night. Give me one chance to tell my side before you destroy everything. If you ever cared for me at all, you owe me that much. See, it's a trap. Maven's voice was flat, certain. Obviously. Rosalind set the letter down with trembling fingers. But what if? What if nothing? Dorian's voice came from the doorway, sharp with barely controlled anger. He strode in, snatched the letter, read it in seconds. You're not going. I wasn't planning to. Rosalind met his eyes steadily. I'm not stupid enough to walk into an isolated location with the man who tried to murder me. Good. Dorian's joy relaxed fractionally. Then we proceed as planned. The gathering is in 3 days. You testify publicly, present evidence, and we end this. But the letter haunted Rosalind throughout the day. Not because she believed Caspian, she knew exactly what he was, knew he'd throw her from that carriage without hesitation. But something about the wording bothered her. You're wrong. Let me explain what really happened. What if there was more to the story? What if understanding his full plan mattered for the testimony? By evening, she'd convinced herself that information was power. That knowing what Caspian would say in his own defense would help her counter it. That maybe, with proper precautions, meeting him could be strategic rather than suicidal. She told no one. The old chapel sat on neutral ground between territories, exactly where the letter specified. Rosalind arrived with guards, 3 of Dorian's best, stationed outside, while she entered alone. The space was small, abandoned, cold stone and broken stained glass filtering pale afternoon light. Caspian stood before the altar, looking exactly as she remembered. Handsome. Charming. The man she'd almost married. You came. His smile was warm, familiar, designed to disarm. I wasn't sure you would. I'm here for information, nothing else. Rosalind kept her distance, every instinct screaming danger. You have 5 minutes. That night, Caspian moved closer, hands spread in placating gesture. I panicked. You're right that I was involved in the financial irregularities. But it wasn't my idea, Rosalind. My father orchestrated everything. He threatened to disown me if I didn't cooperate. When you discovered the ledgers, I knew he'd kill you to protect himself. I pushed you from the carriage to fake your death to save you. Stop. The word cracked like a whip. Don't insult my intelligence with lies. Caspian's mask slipped, just for a second. Something cold flashed in his eyes before the charm returned. You've changed. You tried to murder me. That tends to be transformative. So now you're Dorian Vale's weapon. Caspian's tone turned mocking. His convenient bride, perfectly positioned to destroy me. Do you really think he cares about you beyond your usefulness? The moment you've served your purpose. Unlike you, he's never pretended I was anything other than strategic. Rosalind's voice was steady, certain. But he also saved my life when he could have left me to die. He gave me power when I had none. He treats me like I have value beyond what I can provide him. So yes, I'll be his weapon gladly. Caspian studied her, recalculating. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder, more honest. This doesn't end well for you. Even if you testify, even if some people believe you, there are too many who benefit from keeping things as they are. You'll make enemies you can't imagine. I'll survive. Will you? He stepped closer and Rosalind tensed. Or will you end up like Dorian's sister? Broken. Discarded. Another casualty of games bigger than yourself. The mention of Lyra sent rage spiking through Rosalind's chest. You don't get to speak about her. Why not? I knew her. Knew she was weak. Knew she'd break easily. Caspian's smile turned cruel. Just like I knew you'd be easy to manipulate. Sweet little Rosalind, so desperate to be special that she'd believe anything. The slap echoed through the chapel, Rosalind's palm stinging from contact with his face. Caspian's expression went cold. Dangerous. That was a mistake. No. Marrying you would have been a mistake. This? She gestured between them. This is justice. He lunged. Rosalind barely had time to scream before his hands closed around her throat, slamming her against the stone wall with brutal force. Black spots danced across her vision. She clawed at his hands, kicked, fought with everything Maven had taught her, but he was stronger, an alpha in full fury. Should have stayed dead, he snarled against her ear. Going to finish what I started. Then Dorian was there, moving with predatory speed that seemed impossible. He ripped Caspian away, threw him across the chapel hard enough that stone cracked. The Alpha King's eyes blazed silver-white with rage, power rolling off him in waves that made the air itself feel heavy. Touch her again. Dorian's voice was barely human, and I'll rip your throat out with my teeth. Rosalind collapsed against the wall, gasping, while her guards flooded in, too late to prevent the attack, but present to witness the aftermath. Caspian climbed to his feet, blood trickling from his mouth, murder in his eyes. This isn't over, he spat. The gathering will expose you both. The gathering will expose you, Dorian corrected coldly. For attempted murder. We have witnesses now who saw you attack Rosalind unprovoked. Whatever credibility you thought you'd maintain just evaporated. Realization dawned on Caspian's face, horror and fury mixed. This was a setup. No. Rosalind found her voice, ragged but strong. This was you revealing exactly who you are when you thought no one was watching. And now everyone knows. The Ashcam gathering took place in a manor older than memory, its great hall designed specifically for moments like this, when the fate of territories and bloodlines hung in balance. 40 alphas filled the space, their power creating a pressure that would have crushed a lesser wolf. Rosalind felt it pressing against her skin like physical weight as she stood beside Dorian at the hall's entrance. She wore silver, Maven's choice, deliberate and pointed. A gown that caught light like frost, with the Ravenfield crest embroidered at her shoulder and a crown of winter roses in her dark hair. She looked every inch an alpha queen, which was exactly the point. Caspian stood across the hall with his father, both wearing expressions of carefully controlled contempt. The bruises on Caspian's face from the chapel confrontation were visible even from a distance, testament to his loss of control, his attempt to silence her through violence. Lady Peton, head of the Grand Council, called the assembly to order. We gather to address accusations of corruption within the Hallworth pack, brought forth by Rosalind Greymontvale, Alpha Queen of Ravenfield. Let testimony begin. Rosalind stepped forward, feeling every eye in the room lock onto her. For a moment, fear threatened to swallow her whole. This was it, the moment everything hinged on. Then she felt Dorian's presence at her back, steady and certain. Felt the strength she'd built over these past weeks. Felt the woman she'd become, not despite the snow, but because of it. She spoke clearly, methodically laying out the evidence. The ledgers she'd discovered. The specific account numbers and dates. The widows and orphans who'd gone without while Haltworth coffers swelled. Her voice never wavered, even when Caspian's father interrupted with accusations of lies and manipulation. "You have no proof," the elder Haltworth snarled. "Just the word of a scorned woman." "I have this." Dorian stepped forward, producing a leather portfolio. Records obtained from Haltworth territory through legal channels. Financial documents that corroborate every number Rosalind cited. And something more, testimony from your own housekeeper, who kept duplicate ledgers because she feared exactly this kind of denial. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. A woman emerged from the crowd, elderly, dignified, terrified but determined. She confirmed everything, her voice shaking but clear. The stealing, the deliberate cruelty, the orders to destroy evidence. Caspian's father lunged forward, rage overtaking political calculation. Lies. All lies orchestrated by Vale to destroy us. "We have one more witness," Dorian said quietly. "To Caspian's character. To what he's capable of when threatened." The guards from the chapel stepped forward, recounting in clinical detail how they'd watched Caspian attempt to strangle Rosalind. How he'd attacked unprovoked. How his words had revealed not panic or self-defense, but calculated malice. The tide turned visibly. Rosalind could see it in the Alpha's faces, doubt becoming certainty, political loyalty crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Even the Haltworth's staunchest allies were edging away, recognizing a losing position. But Caspian wasn't finished. "You want truth." His voice cut through the murmurs, sharp with desperate fury. "Fine. Yes, I threw her from the carriage. Yes, I meant for her to die. Because she was weak, just another pathetic wolf who couldn't even shift, who had no business inserting herself into pack politics. She was nothing. Is nothing. And the fact that you're all listening to her. Enough." Rosalind's voice rang out, stopping him mid-rant. Something had shifted inside her. Maybe it was the rage. Maybe it was seeing Caspian finally reveal himself completely. Maybe it was simply time. But the presence in her chest, the one that had been sleeping, waiting, suddenly roared to life. Heat exploded through her body, but not the burning kind. This was cold fire, winter given form and fury. Silver light erupted from her skin, casting the entire hall in ethereal glow. Frost spread across the floor in intricate patterns, climbing walls, covering windows in crystalline beauty that was also absolutely lethal. Rosalind felt her consciousness expand, felt something ancient and powerful rising through her bloodline, recognizing her finally as worthy. The winterborn gift, fully awake. And with it came the silver flame's true power, the ability to burn away lies, to force truth from those who'd built empires on deception. She turned to face Caspian fully, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that weren't entirely human. "Tell them. Tell them everything you've done. Every theft. Every life destroyed. Every moment of cruelty. The silver flame demands truth." Caspian's mouth opened, to protest, to deny, but what came out was confession. Raw. Unfiltered. Unstoppable. He spoke of years of corruption, of deliberate cruelty, of people destroyed simply because they'd been inconvenient. His father tried to silence him, but the words kept coming, pulled from him by power older than alpha hierarchies. When it finally ended, when Caspian stood there with everything exposed, the silence in the hall was absolute. Lady Peton's voice broke it, formal and final. "The Haltworth pack is hereby stripped of territorial rights and council representation. All assets seized pending restitution to victims. Caspian Haltworth and his father will face criminal proceedings." Rosalind felt the silver light fade, the power banking back to embers. She swayed, suddenly exhausted, but Dorian was there immediately, his arm around her waist, holding her steady. "Easy," he murmured. "You did it." She had. Against every odd, against centuries of patriarchal power structures that said women like her didn't matter, she'd won. Justice. Finally. Completely. And the Haltworths would never hurt anyone again. 3 months later, Rosalind stood at the window of her private chambers, not in Ravenfield Manor, but in the newly established Winterbourne Sanctuary. The building rose from the original sacred grove, part shelter and part training center, dedicated to wolves the world had discarded. Abused omegas learning to defend themselves. Women cast aside by powerful men finding their strength. Young wolves who couldn't shift traditionally discovering they might carry other gifts entirely. Dorian's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. Second thoughts. About which part? Rosalind leaned back against his warmth. The sanctuary? The new council position? Us. Any of it. She turned in his embrace, studying the face that had become as familiar as her own. The man who'd saved her life and given her power and somehow, impossibly, fallen in love with her along the way. Their mating bond was real now, not political strategy, but genuine connection forged through fire and winter and choosing each other daily. No second thoughts. She reached up, cupping his face. Though I never imagined this is where that night in the snow would lead. To victory? To transformation. Rosalind smiled. To becoming someone I didn't know I could be. To finding purpose beyond survival. Dorian kissed her softly, reverently. You were always extraordinary. You just needed permission to believe it. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle this time, beautiful rather than deadly. Rosalind had learned to love winter, to see it not as enemy but as teacher. Winter stripped away everything false, everything weak, everything unnecessary. It reduced you to essentials and forced you to become strong enough to survive. She died in the snow once. And risen as something the world had forgotten was possible. Later, she would return to the grove where 7 ancient stones marked Winterbourne territory. She'd kneel before the central stone, and Dorian would offer her a ring, not as political necessity, but as genuine choice. Not because she needed protection, but because they'd chosen partnership. And this time, when she said yes, it would be for love. But first, she stood at her window, watching snow fall over wolves who'd been broken and were learning to heal. Watching a sanctuary built from her pain transform into others' hope. Watching winter work its magic, fierce and beautiful and absolutely uncompromising. Some stories begin in darkness. In betrayal and abandonment and death creeping close on frozen wind. But they don't have to end there. Sometimes you survive the impossible. Sometimes you become the storm rather than its victim. Sometimes, you take everything meant to destroy you and forge it into weapons that dismantle entire systems of cruelty. Sometimes, you win. And Rosalind Greymontvale, once a discarded bride, now an alpha queen and Winterbourne awakened, had won completely. The question that lingered in the winter air was simple. Would you have chosen her side? When she stood before power and demanded accountability, when she refused to be silenced, when she became something the world didn't have words for, would you have believed her? Or would you have been one of the voices telling her to stay quiet, to accept her place, to let the powerful remain untouched? Would you have seen her strength, or just her strangeness? Her truth, or just her audacity to speak it? Because here's what winter teaches. The world is full of people who will tell you to accept injustice for the sake of peace. Who will ask you to make yourself smaller so others can remain comfortable? Who will call your survival threatening and your power dangerous and your refusal to submit unreasonable? And you have to decide, will you freeze under their judgment? Or will you become the storm that forces change? Rosalind chose the storm. And the North would never be the same. If this story lit something inside you, if you felt Rosalind's rage and her resurrection, if you understood what it means to be discarded and choose to rise anyway, then you belong here. Subscribe to Cindy's Wolfheart Stories. Because here, we don't tell tales that comfort the powerful. We tell stories that burn through injustice and celebrate women who refuse to stay down. We tell stories about becoming the storm. And we're just getting started.